Imo City was alive with the sounds of children laughing, birds chirping, and the distant hum of market chatter. The city, nestled in the heart of Imo State, was a vibrant blend of modernity and tradition. Its streets were lined with colorful houses, sprawling mango trees, and the occasional wandering goat or rooster. Life moved at a pleasant pace and the people were deeply connected to one another. Miss Sarah was one of the most beloved figures in Imo City. She was a schoolteacher at St. Michael's Academy, a small school with blue-painted walls and classrooms filled with curious children. Her students adored her, not just because she made learning exciting but also because of the care she showed them. She often stayed late to tutor struggling students and brought extra snacks for those who came to school hungry. Her classroom was a bright space with colorful charts on the walls and books stacked neatly on shelves. Every morning Miss Sarah would stand by the door, welcoming each child with a warm smile. Her favorite part of teaching was storytelling. She had a knack for spinning tales so captivating that even the most restless students sat still, their eyes wide with wonder. Sandra was not one of those students. She was new to the school, having transferred mid-year. Sandra was different from the others. She had sharp eyes that seemed to look through people and a way of speaking that could silence a room. From the start she was trouble. She disrupted lessons, refused to do her work, and often whispered things that made her classmates uneasy. One sunny Tuesday the class was working on a group assignment about animals. Miss Sarah walked around helping each group. When she reached Sandra's group she noticed that Sandra wasn't participating. Instead she was drawing strange symbols in her notebook. "Sandra," Miss Sarah said kindly, "you need to contribute to the group work. It's not fair to let others do everything." Sandra didn't even look up. "Why should I?" she muttered under her breath. Miss Sarah frowned. "Because this is a team effort and everyone needs to play their part." Sandra rolled her eyes and snapped her notebook shut. "Maybe the others should learn to handle things without me," she said, her voice dripping with defiance. The classroom fell silent. The other students watched with wide eyes, sensing the tension. "Sandra," Miss Sarah said firmly, "this attitude is unacceptable. If you refuse to work with your group, you'll have to sit out during recess." Sandra's face darkened. Her lips twisted into a smirk, but her eyes burned with anger. "You'll regret this," she whispered so softly that only Miss Sarah could hear. Miss Sarah stood her ground, but a shiver ran down her spine. She dismissed it, chalking it up to nerves. Sandra stayed in her seat during recess, glaring at her teacher the entire time. That evening Miss Sarah walked home, her bag slung over her shoulder. The streets of Imo City were peaceful, with neighbors sitting outside their homes, chatting and laughing. She greeted everyone warmly, her spirits lifting as she thought about the plans she had for the next day's lessons. She loved her job and no amount of trouble from one student could change that. Her small house sat at the edge of the city, near a grove of tall palm trees. It was a modest but cozy home with a garden full of hibiscus flowers. Miss Sarah loved the evenings when she could sit on her porch with a cup of tea, listening to the distant drums from the village square. That night the stars were unusually bright and the air was cool. As Miss Sarah prepared for bed she thought about Sandra. There was something about the girl that unsettled her, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. Every child deserved patience and understanding, she reminded herself. As she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't have known that her life was about to change forever. For now all was calm in Imo City, and Miss Sarah's heart was filled with gratitude for the simple joys of life. But in the shadows, a storm was brewing, a storm that would test her faith, her courage, and her resolve. The night after Sandra's rebellion in the classroom was like no other Miss Sarah had ever experienced. At first it was quiet, almost too quiet. The usual symphony of crickets and rustling palm leaves seemed muffled. Instead, there was a heaviness in the air, as if the very night itself were holding its breath. Miss Sarah lay in bed, clutching her Bible, a nightly routine that brought her comfort. But as she turned off her bedside lamp, the silence in the room felt oppressive. She whispered a prayer and tried to sleep, but her mind kept drifting to Sandra's unsettling behavior. There was something in the girl's gaze earlier that day, something unnerving. Around midnight Miss Sarah was startled awake by a sound. At first she thought it was the wind, but then she realized it was something else whispering. It was faint, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably there. She sat up, straining her ears. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then a soft creak came from the corner of the room. Miss Sarah's heart raced as she reached for the lamp. The light flickered on, but the room appeared empty. She exhaled, trying to steady her breathing. "It's just my imagination," she murmured to herself. But even as she said it, the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day Miss Sarah arrived at school, her usually cheerful demeanor dampened by a restless night. Her students noticed immediately. The younger children, who adored her, tried to cheer her up with drawings and jokes, but she couldn't shake the unease. Sandra, on the other hand, seemed different. She was unusually quiet, her sharp eyes observing everything. Miss Sarah couldn't decide if this was a good sign or if it meant something worse. That night the whispers returned, but this time they were louder. Shadows flickered on the walls of her room, though there was no light source to cast them. Objects in her home moved slightly, her chair scraping against the floor as if nudged by unseen hands, her curtains swaying even though the windows were shut. Miss Sarah was terrified but resolute. She lit a candle, opened her Bible, and began to pray aloud. The strange occurrences seemed to pause for a moment, but the oppressive feeling didn't leave. The following morning, news began to spread through Imo City about Miss Sarah's illness. Her normally robust health had taken a sudden turn. She felt weak, her voice hoarse and her skin clammy. Her neighbors visited, bringing soups and herbal remedies, but nothing seemed to help. "She looks like someone has placed a heavy burden on her soul," one of the elders remarked, shaking his head. Sandra's classmates began whispering about her in hushed tones. "Sandra's a witch," one boy said. "I saw her drawing strange symbols in her book." "Do you think she's the reason Miss Sarah is sick?" a girl asked, her voice trembling. The rumors reached Sandra's ears, but she didn't deny or confirm them. Instead, she smiled faintly, a gesture that sent chills through her classmates. Meanwhile, Miss Sarah, feeling desperate and helpless, decided to seek help. She went to visit Baba Daniel, the wisest elder in Imo City and the community's spiritual guide. His home was a simple hut surrounded by medicinal plants and charms for protection. Baba Daniel welcomed Miss Sarah with a knowing look. "I've been expecting you," he said, his deep voice steady and calm. Miss Sarah's eyes widened. "You have? The signs have been all around us," Baba Daniel said. "The night has grown restless. The air is heavy with dark forces." Miss Sarah explained everything: Sandra's behavior, the strange whispers, her sudden illness. Baba Daniel listened carefully, nodding. When she finished, he stood and fetched a leather-bound book filled with ancient wisdom. "You are under spiritual attack," he said gravely. "This girl, Sandra, is not ordinary. She is tied to forces that thrive on fear and chaos. What can I do?" Miss Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I've been praying, but it feels like I'm losing this battle." Baba Daniel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Faith is your greatest weapon, but you must also prepare yourself. This will not be an easy fight. We must confront the source of this darkness directly." Miss Sarah left Baba Daniel's hut with a sense of both fear and hope. That night, as she prepared to face another round of the strange occurrences, she felt a flicker of determination. She would not let fear consume her. But as the night deepened, the whispers returned, louder than ever. Shadows moved as if alive, and the temperature in her room plummeted. Suddenly, a chilling voice echoed through the room. "You should have left me alone." Miss Sarah froze. It was Sandra's voice. "Leave me in peace or you will regret it," the voice continued, followed by cruel laughter that sent shivers down Miss Sarah's spine. Clutching her Bible, Miss Sarah began to pray aloud, tears streaming down her face. The room seemed to shake, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence was deafening, but Miss Sarah knew the battle was far from over. The next morning, Imo City buzzed with unease. Miss Sarah's condition had worsened, and the whispers about Sandra grew louder. Some people began avoiding the girl, while others whispered prayers whenever she walked past. Sandra, however, seemed unfazed. She carried herself with a confidence that only added to the fear surrounding her. But deep down, even Sandra could feel the tension growing. The stage was set for a confrontation, one that would shake the very foundation of the city. Miss Sarah spent the next day in quiet preparation. Baba Daniel had given her a special prayer routine to follow, along with herbs and protective charms. The elder assured her that the strength to overcome Sandra's attacks lay within her faith. Though her body was weak, her spirit burned with a newfound determination. Imo City buzzed with whispers of the strange occurrences. Neighbors gathered at street corners sharing rumors in hushed tones. While some believed Miss Sarah's misfortunes were supernatural, others dismissed the idea, blaming stress or overwork. But for those closest to her, the evidence was undeniable. Sandra's behavior only fueled the growing unease. She arrived at school that morning with an air of smug defiance. Her classmates avoided her, their gazes filled with fear. Even the teachers kept their distance, unsure how to address the troubling rumors. Miss Sarah arrived late, her face pale but her eyes steady. The classroom fell silent as she entered. Sandra watched her closely, her sharp gaze seeming to challenge her teacher. "Good morning, class," Miss Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. She refused to let fear dictate her actions. "Let's begin." The day passed uneventfully, but the tension in the room was palpable. Sandra sat at the back, doodling strange shapes in her notebook. Miss Sarah noticed but chose not to confront her. She knew the real battle wasn't in the classroom, it was far deeper, darker and more dangerous. That evening Miss Sarah returned to Baba Daniel's hut. The elder was waiting for her, seated cross-legged on a woven mat. The hut was filled with the scent of burning herbs, and a soft light flickered from an oil lamp. "Are you ready to face the darkness?" Baba Daniel asked, his voice steady. Miss Sarah nodded, though her hands trembled. "I am. But I need your guidance." Baba Daniel explained the plan. They would confront Sandra directly, not as a child but as the vessel of the dark forces influencing her. It was not about harming Sandra but freeing her from the grip of the coven that had taken hold of her soul. "She is still a child, Sarah," Baba Daniel said. "Remember, we are not fighting her. We are fighting what controls her." Miss Sarah listened intently, every word sinking deep into her heart. She prayed silently, asking for strength and clarity. By the time she left Baba Daniel's hut, she felt a glimmer of hope, though it was overshadowed by the enormity of what lay ahead. That night Miss Sarah didn't go to bed. Instead, she sat in her living room, surrounded by the items Baba Daniel had given her: a small crucifix, a bottle of holy water, and a protective charm made from sacred beads. She prayed continuously, her voice a steady rhythm against the oppressive silence of the night. Just past midnight, the atmosphere in her house changed. The air grew icy and the faint smell of sulfur filled the room. Shadows began to stretch and twist unnaturally, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You're wasting your time," the chilling voice said again. It was Sandra's voice, but distorted, filled with malice. "You cannot win." Miss Sarah gripped her Bible tightly. "In the name of God, I rebuke you," she said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her heart. The room seemed to shake, and a dark figure began to form in the corner. It was vague and shadowy but radiated a menacing presence. Miss Sarah continued to pray, louder now, her voice trembling but resolute. Suddenly there was a loud knock at the door. Startled, Miss Sarah hesitated. The knocking grew louder, almost frantic. She got up cautiously and opened the door to find Baba Daniel standing there, his expression grave. "It's time," he said. Together they left Miss Sarah's house and made their way to Sandra's home. The streets were eerily empty, the usual nighttime sounds absent. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. Sandra's house was dark, but a faint glow emanated from her room. Baba Daniel knocked firmly on the door, and after a long pause it opened. Sandra stood there, her face shadowed but her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice calm but dripping with venom. "We've come to help you," Baba Daniel said. "You don't have to live like this, Sandra." Sandra laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Help me." "I don't need your help." Miss Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Sandra, this isn't you. Whatever is controlling you, you can fight it. You don't have to let it win." Sandra's expression faltered for a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. But then her eyes narrowed and the glow intensified. "You don't understand," she hissed. "You can't save me." Before anyone could react, a forceful wind burst through the room, knocking over furniture and extinguishing the light. Baba Daniel and Miss Sarah stood their ground, clutching their protective charms. "Keep praying," Baba Daniel urged. "Do not stop no matter what happens." Miss Sarah began to pray aloud, her voice trembling but determined. Baba Daniel joined her, chanting in a deep rhythmic tone. The wind howled and Sandra let out a piercing scream, her body convulsing as the dark force fought to maintain its hold on her. The battle continued for what felt like hours. The room was filled with chaos, shadows twisting, objects flying, and an oppressive darkness pressing down on them. But Miss Sarah and Baba Daniel didn't waver. Their prayers grew stronger, filled with faith and determination. Finally, as dawn began to break, the darkness seemed to weaken. Sandra collapsed to the floor, her body trembling. The room grew still, the oppressive energy lifting. Baba Daniel rushed to Sandra's side, checking her pulse. "She's alive," he said softly. Miss Sarah knelt beside Sandra, tears streaming down her face. The girl's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, they were clear, free of the dark influence that had consumed her. "Miss Sarah," Sandra whispered, her voice weak and filled with confusion. "I'm here, Sandra," Miss Sarah said, her voice gentle. "You're going to be okay." The sun rose over Imo City, casting its golden light over the quiet streets. The battle had been won, but the journey to healing was just beginning. The morning after the confrontation, Imo City began to stir with cautious hope. Word spread quickly about the events at Sandra's home, though the details were murky. Some claimed that Baba Daniel had defeated a demon. Others whispered about Miss Sarah's bravery. Everyone agreed on one thing: something powerful had happened, and Sandra was at the center of it. Miss Sarah returned home with Baba Daniel as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but her heart felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, the oppressive fear that had followed her was gone. Baba Daniel advised her to rest and continue her prayers, warning that the battle might be over, but the war was not yet won. Meanwhile, Sandra remained in her home, physically weak but free of the dark force that had gripped her. Her parents, who had long been distant and aloof, now hovered over her with a mix of fear and concern. They had always known Sandra was different, but they had chosen to ignore the signs. Now they couldn't escape the truth. Sandra was quiet, her usual defiance replaced by an unsettling emptiness. She spent most of the day staring out the window, her thoughts a swirling storm of regret and confusion. For the first time she felt the weight of her actions. She had been drawn to the coven out of a need for power and belonging, but now she saw the cost of her choices. She didn't know if she could ever make things right. Miss Sarah returned to her classroom 2 days later, determined to bring some normalcy back to her life. The students greeted her with cautious smiles, their eyes full of questions they didn't dare ask. Sandra's desk at the back of the room remained empty, and a heavy silence hung over the class. During recess, a group of students gathered around Miss Sarah, their curiosity finally getting the better of them. "Miss Sarah," one of the younger boys asked hesitantly, "is it true that Sandra is a witch?" Miss Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sandra is a person just like you and me," she said gently. "Sometimes people make choices that lead them down dark paths. But everyone deserves a chance to find the light again." The children nodded, though they didn't fully understand. For them, the idea of witches and dark forces was something out of a storybook. But Miss Sarah knew the reality was far more complicated. Sandra returned to school a week later. Her once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. She avoided eye contact with her classmates and kept her head down during lessons. The other students whispered behind her back, their fear and curiosity mingling in equal measure. Miss Sarah watched Sandra closely, her heart aching for the girl. She saw the struggle in Sandra's eyes, the guilt, the shame, and the uncertainty about her place in the world. Miss Sarah wanted to help, but she knew Sandra would have to take the first step. That opportunity came one afternoon when Sandra stayed behind after class. She lingered at her desk, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her notebook. Miss Sarah approached her cautiously, her voice soft. "Sandra, is there something you want to talk about?" she asked. Sandra looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Miss Sarah, I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. I didn't mean for it to go so far." Miss Sarah sat down beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It takes courage to admit when we've done wrong," she said. "But you have the chance to make things right. It won't be easy, but I believe you can do it." Sandra nodded, wiping her tears. For the first time in a long while she felt a glimmer of hope. As the weeks passed, Sandra began to change. She started participating in class, helping her classmates, and even volunteering for tasks. Slowly but surely the other students began to accept her again, though some remained wary. Miss Sarah continued to support Sandra, encouraging her to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. Baba Daniel also became a mentor to the girl, guiding her with wisdom and patience. He taught her about the power of faith and the importance of choosing the light over the darkness. But the journey was not without its challenges. Sandra struggled with nightmares, remnants of the coven's influence that refused to let go completely. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed by guilt and doubt, questioning whether she deserved forgiveness. During one particularly difficult night, Sandra visited Baba Daniel's hut. She poured out her fears, confessing that she didn't think she could ever escape the shadow of her past. Baba Daniel listened carefully, then spoke in his steady, calming voice. The light does not ask where you have been, only where you are willing to go. You cannot change the past, but you can choose to walk forward in faith. And with every step, the darkness will fade. Sandra clung to those words, using them as a source of strength in the days that followed. One day, a community meeting was called to address the lingering fears and tensions in Imo City. Many residents were still uneasy, unsure if the danger had truly passed. Baba Daniel and Miss Sarah attended the meeting, along with Sandra and her parents. As the gathering began, murmurs of doubt and suspicion filled the air. Some people wanted Sandra and her family to leave the city, fearing she would bring more trouble. Others argued for forgiveness, pointing to the changes they had seen in her. Baba Daniel stood to speak, his voice commanding attention. Fear thrives in ignorance, he said. We have seen the power of darkness, but we have also seen the power of faith. Sandra has chosen to walk a new path, and it is our duty as a community to guide and support her. Miss Sarah also spoke, sharing her belief in redemption and the importance of second chances. Her words resonated deeply, and the mood in the room began to shift. Sandra stood last, her hands trembling but her voice steady. I know I've done terrible things, she said. But I want to change. I want to make things right. I can't do it alone, but I promise I will do everything I can to be better. The room fell silent, and then one by one the residents of Imo City nodded in agreement. The road to healing would be long, but they were willing to take it together. That night, Miss Sarah knelt by her bed, tears streaming down her face as she prayed. She thanked God for giving her the strength to endure and for showing her that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. The battle was not just about defeating darkness but about finding the light within and helping others do the same. Months passed and the once tense air in Imo City began to soften. Life resumed its rhythm, but the events surrounding Sandra and Miss Sarah left an indelible mark on the community. People began to speak of hope, forgiveness, and the strength that comes from standing together. Sandra worked tirelessly to rebuild her life. She started small, helping her classmates with their studies and volunteering at community events. Each act of kindness chipped away at the stigma she carried. And though some remained wary, most began to see her for what she was, a girl who had lost her way but found the courage to start again. Miss Sarah continued to play a vital role in Sandra's transformation. She invited Sandra to join her after school, offering extra lessons and mentorship. They grew close, their bond deepened by their shared struggle against the darkness that had once threatened to consume them both. One sunny afternoon, Sandra and Miss Sarah walked together to Baba Daniel's hut. Sandra carried a small woven basket filled with fruits, a gesture of gratitude for the elder who had been her guiding light. Baba Daniel welcomed them with his usual warmth, his wise eyes twinkling. You both look well, he said, gesturing for them to sit. We owe so much to you, Miss Sarah said sincerely. Without your guidance, I don't know where we'd be. Baba Daniel shook his head, a humble smile on his face. I am merely a servant of the Creator. The strength to overcome came from within you both. Sandra nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. You taught me that faith is not just about belief but about action, choosing light over darkness every day. The three spent the afternoon talking, sharing stories and laughter. It was a moment of peace, a reminder that even after the fiercest storms, the sun will shine again. Imo City's annual cultural festival approached, a time of celebration and unity. This year, the festival carried special significance, as it symbolized the community's triumph over fear and division. Everyone contributed to the preparations, including Sandra, who volunteered to help organize the children's activities. On the day of the festival, the city square was transformed into a vibrant tapestry of colors, music, and laughter. Stalls lined the streets, offering traditional foods and crafts, while performers entertained the crowds with dances and songs. Miss Sarah watched proudly as Sandra led a group of children in a folk dance, her movements graceful and her face lit with joy. The transformation was undeniable. Sandra was no longer the troubled, defiant girl she had once been. She was a beacon of hope, a living testament to the power of redemption. As the evening drew near, the festival's main event began, a storytelling circle led by Baba Daniel. Residents gathered around a roaring bonfire, their faces glowing in the flickering light. Baba Daniel spoke of the city's journey, weaving the recent events into a tale of faith, courage, and the triumph of light over darkness. Sandra stood beside him, her hands clasped nervously. When Baba Daniel finished his tale, he turned to her. "Sandra has something she would like to say," he announced. The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on the young girl. Sandra took a deep breath, her voice trembling but clear. "I want to thank all of you," she began, "for giving me a second chance, for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I know I've made mistakes, but I promise to spend the rest of my life making things right." Her words were met with applause, and many in the crowd wiped away tears. Miss Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she watched Sandra stand tall, a picture of grace and humility. That night, as the festival wound down, Miss Sarah returned home, her heart full. She knelt by her bed and prayed, her words filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for guiding us through the darkness and bringing us into the light. Thank you for showing me the power of forgiveness and the strength of faith." Sandra too knelt in prayer that night. She prayed for forgiveness, for strength, and for the wisdom to continue walking the path of light. She thanked God for Miss Sarah, Baba Daniel, and the community that had given her a chance to heal. In the months that followed, Imo City flourished. The events surrounding Sandra and Miss Sarah became a story told to inspire others, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. Sandra grew into a confident, compassionate young woman, using her experiences to help others who felt lost. She became a mentor to younger children, teaching them the importance of kindness, resilience, and faith. Miss Sarah continued her work as a teacher, her love for her students deeper than ever. She knew that her role extended beyond the classroom, that she was not just teaching lessons but shaping lives. Years later, during another cultural festival, Sandra stood on a stage before the entire community. Now a young adult, she was preparing to leave for university, where she planned to study social work. Her journey had come full circle, and she wanted to dedicate her future to helping others find their way, just as she had. Miss Sarah and Baba Daniel watched from the crowd, their hearts swelling with pride. As Sandra spoke, her voice steady and filled with conviction, they knew that their efforts had not been in vain. The festival ended with a grand display of fireworks, the night sky bursting into a kaleidoscope of colors. Sandra stood beside Miss Sarah and Baba Daniel, their faces lit with awe and joy. "Thank you," Sandra said softly, her voice almost lost in the cheers and laughter around them. Miss Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did this, Sandra. You chose the light and you never gave up." Sandra smiled, her heart filled with gratitude and hope. She knew the journey ahead would not be without challenges, but she was ready to face them, her faith guiding her every step of the way. As the last firework faded into the night sky, the city of Imo stood as a beacon of unity, resilience, and faith, a community that had faced the darkness and emerged stronger together.